In 1951, the Mafia didn't get raided first, it got televised. A clean-cut insider sat under studio lights and described a system built to survive silence, but cameras don't fear Omertà. The question is, when America started watching, who panicked first, Washington or the bosses? In 1951, America didn't just learn that the Mafia existed. America learned that it could watch the Mafia exist, not through a newspaper headline that got folded and tossed, not through a rumor whispered in a bar, but through a television set glowing in the corner of the living room, where a man in a suit sat under hot studio lights and spoke into a microphone like he was reading the weather. And that was the real turning point. Because until that moment, organized crime had a system that worked. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't clean, but it was stable. The bosses kept their names off paper. The money moved through hands that didn't ask questions. The violence was calibrated, sharp, private, and deniable. And when law enforcement got too close, there was an old solution that had protected the whole structure for decades: silence. Omertà wasn't just a code, it was an operating system. If you could keep people quiet long enough, if you could keep a jury unsure, a witness scared, a cop confused, then power could outlast pressure. That was the rule of the street, the courthouse, and the back room. But television didn't care about the old rules. Television didn't need a conviction to create a verdict in the public mind. It didn't need a signed statement or a jury vote. It only needed a face, a voice, and a story. And in 1951, a new kind of witness walked into that bright, unforgiving space. An insider who wasn't a trigger man, not the kind of guy with a nickname and a police record that made him easy to dismiss. He was the kind of insider bosses relied on precisely because he looked harmless. A courier who delivered envelopes that were never opened in public. An accountant who balanced books that never said what they meant. A lawyer's assistant who knew which names were real and which ones were only used on paper. A man who had lived close enough to the machine to understand how it worked, and far enough from the street that America might actually believe him. That's why this moment hit differently. When a gunman talks, the public expects violence. They can blame it on temperament, on that life, on chaos. But when a clean-cut insider talks, when he describes schedules, payoffs, routines, and the quiet bureaucracy of crime, organized crime stops looking like a collection of thugs. It starts looking like an institution. And that was exactly the problem for every boss in America. In 1951, the institution was being dragged into the light in real time. This wasn't a courtroom where testimony vanished into transcripts. This wasn't a private grand jury where prosecutors could be pressured and witnesses could be handled behind the scenes. This was a stage. Cameras created a new kind of pressure, pressure that traveled faster than intimidation. A witness could be threatened, bought, or disappeared. But once his story went out live, it didn't matter if he went silent afterward. The story had already multiplied. It had already become dinner-table conversation. It had already become a political weapon, and that's where the balance of power began to tilt. By 1951, the United States was changing. The post-war boom had money everywhere. New cars, new suburbs, new businesses. The country wanted to believe it was modern now, cleaner, safer, controlled. But crime was modernizing too, and the underworld had learned how to feed off that prosperity without looking like an underworld anymore. Gambling operations weren't just backroom dice games. They were networks, betting slips, phone calls, runners, cutouts, accountants. Protection wasn't just shaking down a shopkeeper. It was controlling unions, docks, trucking routes, construction contracts. And corruption wasn't a brown envelope slipped to a patrolman. It was a relationship with politicians who needed votes, with businessmen who needed labor peace, with officials who liked the feeling of being taken care of. It was bigger than the public had ever been asked to understand. So when the Senate launched televised hearings on organized crime, when politicians realized that the camera could turn crime into a national drama, it created an opportunity for the government and a crisis for the Mafia at the exact same time. For senators, it was a stage to look tough, to look clean, to look necessary. For law enforcement, it was a megaphone. For journalists, it was gold. For the public, it was a show. For the bosses, it was a nightmare. because the Mafia's control depended on the idea that the public didn't really see it. They might suspect it, they might joke about it, but seeing is different. Seeing creates memory, seeing creates names, seeing creates fear that travels upward into mayoral offices, union leadership, legitimate corporations that had been comfortable keeping things quiet. Television threatened the Mafia's most valuable asset, plausible deniability. It introduced a new rule that every boss would have to learn fast. You can't intimidate a camera, you can't bribe a broadcast once it's already out, and you can't put the public back in the dark once they've watched the shape of your system form on screen. That's why the testimony mattered more than the content. Even if the insider said nothing new, the format itself was a weapon. The government was essentially telling the underworld, "We are going to make your secrecy impossible," and the underworld understood that immediately. Because secrecy wasn't just about not talking, it was about controlling the environment. A boss could walk into a courtroom surrounded by lawyers, political friends, and paid respect. He could stare down a prosecutor. He could make a witness feel alone. But on live TV, the environment belonged to someone else. On live TV, the boss wasn't the biggest presence in the room anymore. The camera was. The lens framed faces, captured pauses, magnified nervous tics and forced smiles. It made evasion look like guilt. It made "I don't know" sound rehearsed. It made silence feel like an admission. And worse, it invited the public to participate. Millions of people who would never sit through a trial, were suddenly watching the mechanics of power being questioned. They were watching senators ask about money, about meetings, about names. They were watching the underworld's favorite defense, confusion, fail in front of a national audience that was finally paying attention. So the Mafia did what it always did when a new threat appeared. It adapted. Some bosses tightened discipline, fewer meetings, fewer drivers, fewer extra mouths who knew too much. Some bosses moved money. They shifted cash into safer, legitimate fronts, or relocated operations to places where cameras and committees couldn't reach. Some bosses searched for the leak, the way a ship searches for a hole, not with anger at first, but with terror, because one small breach can sink everything. And some bosses made the worst mistake of all. They panicked and overreacted, because panic creates noise, and noise creates evidence. Sudden disappearances attract questions. Sudden transfers of ownership create paper trails. Sudden violence creates headlines, and headlines feed television, and television feeds politics. In 1951, the bosses were facing an enemy that grew stronger every time they tried to fight it the old way. That's the core problem of this story. Not one man testified, but what happens to an empire built on silence when the whole country invents a new way to listen? Because once an insider starts talking on live television, the danger isn't just what he says today. The danger is what it makes possible tomorrow. It teaches every small-time operator, every nervous bookkeeper, every mid-level fixer watching from a back room. Silence is not the only option anymore. There is another path. One that doesn't require winning a gunfight or surviving a prison sentence. One that simply requires walking into the light and letting the country watch. And for the bosses, that realization was poison. So the question becomes immediate and personal. Who was this insider, really? What did he see close enough to describe it clearly? And once the broadcast ended, what did the bosses do, quietly, urgently and permanently, to make sure it never happened again? The first thing the bosses did was try to answer the question that always comes first in their world. How close is he? Because an insider is not one thing. There are levels to it, and every level changes what the organization has to do next. A street guy can name faces, he can describe violence, he can talk about fear, but he usually can't explain the machine. A numbers runner can describe routes and drop points. A bookkeeper can describe collections and percentages. A lawyer's man can describe the shape of the whole structure, who meets who, how messages travel, how money gets washed clean enough to walk into a bank. And in 1951, the men who mattered weren't as worried about bodies as they were about diagrams, because diagrams create strategy for prosecutors, for senators, for police departments that suddenly had a national spotlight and a career incentive to make progress. So when the word spread that a clean-looking insider was going to talk on live television, the underworld treated it like a fire alarm. Phones lit up across New York, Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland. calls made from diners, corner offices, hotel rooms, union halls. Not long conversations. Just short, coded checks. Where is he staying? Who is guarding him? What does he know? Who brought him in? And the most dangerous question of all, is he doing this for protection, or is he doing it for revenge? Because if it was revenge, then there was no ceiling. A man talking for survival might limit his damage. A man talking to hurt you will keep talking until it hurts enough. The hearings themselves had already been building pressure. Senator Estes Kefauver's committee wasn't the first government effort to chase organized crime, but it was the first one that looked like a show the entire country could watch. That changed the behavior on both sides. Senators started asking questions like prosecutors, but performing them like actors. The pauses were longer, the statements were sharper. They weren't only building cases, they were building reputations, and the Mafia understood reputation better than anyone. They understood that a televised hearing could turn a local rumor into a national truth overnight. It could take a name known only to detectives and make it known to housewives in Nebraska. It could take a quietly profitable racket and turn it into a political problem that demanded action, which meant the hearing room wasn't just a room, it was a weapon. The witness, this insider, was brought in with the kind of caution that tells you everyone knew what was at stake. Not because the government was suddenly competent, but because the government had learned something new too. If you let him get hurt, you don't just lose a case, you lose the story, and the story was the point. So they moved him through side entrances, they put him in anonymous hotel rooms, they rotated escorts, they kept him away from windows, they controlled his schedule, they treated him like a piece of evidence that could walk. But the underworld didn't need a perfect address, it only needed a crack. A familiar face in a lobby, a phone call overheard, a driver who liked to talk, a doorman who got paid to notice things. Because organized crime did not survive by being stronger than the government, it survived by being more patient, more connected, and more realistic about how people behave under pressure. And the bosses, sitting in their own private rooms, watched the early broadcasts with the same cold attention they used to watch a rival's funeral. Not because they enjoyed it, because they were studying the threat. In the beginning, the insider didn't even have to name the most powerful men. He only had to describe the system in a way that sounded organized. He talked about envelopes that arrived every Friday. He talked about collections that were treated like rent. He talked about a percentage that always went upward. He talked about lawyers who never asked questions, only solved problems. He talked about a rule: you don't call the boss directly, you don't write the boss's name, you don't even admit the boss exists. And as soon as he said that last part on live television, it created a paradox the Mafia couldn't fix, because the old defense had always been denial. There is no organization, there is no such thing as a Mafia, these are just independent criminals. But now denial sounded like a trick, like a rehearsed line, and the witness was giving America a new way to see the lie. He was explaining that the absence of proof wasn't innocence, it was design. That's when the panic spread upward. Not street panic, not wild panic, executive panic. The kind where a man doesn't raise his voice, but he cancels meetings, he changes routes, he stops trusting the people he's known for 10 years. He looks at his own accountant and wonders what that man could say if he ever got scared. And right there, in that silent reaction, you can see the new rule forming. Because the Mafia had always needed two things at the same time. 1, a public face that looked legitimate. 2, a private structure that could not be proven. Television threatened both. It made the legitimate face harder to maintain, because the public could now associate respectable men with criminal systems without ever seeing them commit a crime. And it made the private structure easier to imagine, because the witness described it like a business with routines, percentages, and chain-of-command discipline. The bosses realized something horrifying. Even if they beat the cases, they could lose the country, so they moved into counterplay. The first counterplay was legal, because legal counterplay looks clean on camera. Lawyers started preparing witnesses like they were coaching fighters, not to tell the truth, not even to lie convincingly, but to become unusable. The phrases were simple: I don't recall, I don't understand the question, I refuse to answer on the grounds it may incriminate me. The Fifth Amendment became a shield, but also a signal. It told the public, I'm smart enough not to talk, but it also told the public, there's something here to hide. And the bosses had to accept a new reality. On television, even the correct legal move could look like guilt. Then came the second counterplay, intimidation, but applied differently than before. In the old world, you intimidate the witness. In the new world, you intimidate the process. You pressure anyone connected to the witness, his employer, his landlord, his relatives, the friend who introduced him to the committee, the police officer assigned to him, the low-level court clerk who might accidentally misplace a form. You don't always need to touch the witness if you can make the infrastructure around him feel unsafe. Because fear spreads sideways, it makes people stop returning calls, it makes them cancel appointments, it makes them forget what they saw, it makes them decide that helping isn't worth it. And while all of that was happening quietly, there was a third counterplay that was even more sophisticated, a cover-up aimed at the audience. Because if television was the new battlefield, then the public's belief was the new prize. So the Mafia tried to reframe what America was seeing. They pushed the idea that the committee was grandstanding, that witnesses were lying for immunity, that the whole thing was a circus designed to scare voters. They used friendly journalists, friendly politicians, quiet pressure through ad money and favors. They didn't need to control every newspaper. They only needed enough noise to create uncertainty, because uncertainty protects power. And that is what makes 1951 feel like a genuine turning point, instead of just another scandal. The conflict wasn't only about arrests, it was about narrative. The government wanted a simple message: we are exposing a national criminal conspiracy. The Mafia wanted a different message: this is exaggeration, this is politics, this is not real. But then the camera did something the Mafia couldn't negotiate with. It captured faces. Not just the faces of the insiders, but the faces of the men called to testify, men who had spent decades perfecting the art of being invisible while standing in plain sight. And some of them broke, just a little, a twitch, a smirk, a jaw tightening when a name was mentioned, the sudden controlled anger of a man who wasn't used to being questioned by anyone he couldn't punish later. This is why those hearings became legendary, not because every detail was proven, but because the public finally saw the psychology of power, and the bosses watching from their own rooms understood the damage instantly. You could survive indictments, you could survive raids, but surviving being seen was different, because once America watched a man refuse to answer question after question, once America watched an insider calmly describe how envelopes moved upward, once America watched senators talk about syndicates like they were corporations, the old street rule of silence was no longer enough. Now you needed a camera rule, not just don't talk, but don't give them a moment. And the problem was the moment had already happened. The insider had already spoken, and somewhere behind the scenes, every boss in America was doing the same calculation in his head. If he can do it once, how many more will follow? The bosses didn't need a written report to understand what had just happened. They only needed to imagine the next 6 months. Because once the public sees the shape of the system becomes easier to hunt. Detectives start looking for patterns instead of incidents. Prosecutors start building chains instead of single charges. Reporters stop chasing bodies and start chasing money. And inside the underworld, the most dangerous person stops being the rival gunman. It becomes the quiet employee with access. So the first real consequence of the live testimony wasn't a mass wave of arrests. It was a shift in internal discipline that you could feel immediately if you were close enough to notice it. Fewer names spoken out loud, fewer social meetings that existed only to show power, fewer favors done casually, because favors create obligations, and obligations create witnesses. The bosses began treating information like contraband. If you didn't need to know, you didn't get to know. If you did need to know, you learned it in pieces. If you couldn't handle pressure, you were pushed out, sometimes gently, sometimes permanently. And on paper, the Mafia's public posture hardened into something that looked almost ridiculous, but worked for a reason: more denials, more there is no organization, more men in suits acting offended that anyone would even ask, because they were trying to restore the one thing television had stolen from them: ambiguity. If the public was confused, the system could breathe. If the public was certain, the system would be forced to defend itself in ways it wasn't built for. That's why the cover-up that followed the hearings didn't look like one dramatic move. It looked like hundreds of small moves that all had the same goal: make the story difficult to continue. Witnesses who were supposed to appear suddenly couldn't be found. Men who might have cooperated suddenly remembered they had families. Local politicians who had loved grandstanding in front of cameras suddenly discovered they had better things to do. And behind that, quietly, money started moving like a tide. Cash that had been kept close began traveling outward, into legitimate fronts, into safer jurisdictions, into businesses that didn't raise questions if the numbers were clean enough. Because the bosses had learned a brutal lesson: if television was going to shine a light, then the smartest response wasn't to fight the light, it was to build shadows that looked legitimate. And while the bosses were adapting, the government was adapting too. The committee hearings didn't solve organized crime, they didn't end it. But they created something that mattered more than one case file. They created public permission. Before 1951, the Mafia was easy to treat as a rumor, an excuse, a scapegoat. After 1951, it was something voters had watched with their own eyes. That changed what politicians could demand, what budgets could be justified, what careers could be built. Police departments started forming more specialized units. Federal agencies felt pressure to coordinate instead of compete. And prosecutors began thinking longer term, building theories of conspiracy that could survive even when individual witnesses collapsed. Because that's the other reality the hearings exposed. Witnesses do collapse. Some collapse from fear, some collapse from money, some collapse because they never planned to go all the way, they only planned to survive the moment. And the Mafia counted on that. They counted on time, they counted on exhaustion, they counted on the public moving on to the next thing, because in America, attention has always been a kind of weather. Violent storms, then clear skies. But television altered that too. A live moment doesn't vanish the way a whispered rumor vanishes. It gets repeated, it gets quoted, it gets reenacted, it becomes part of a shared memory. Even if a witness goes silent later, the first testimony keeps living. That's why the bosses treated the entire event like contamination. The goal wasn't only to stop that man, the goal was to stop the idea that a man like him could exist again. And that's where the new rule truly settled in. For decades, Omertà had been enforced through proximity, neighborhoods, social circles, physical control. You broke the code, and the consequences found you where you lived. In 1951, the code had to evolve into something else, because now the danger wasn't only a man talking, it was a man talking where the whole country could hear him. So the new rule became simple, and it spread through the underworld like doctrine. Silence is no longer just survival. Silence is strategy in public. If you are ever exposed, you don't just stay quiet to protect yourself. You stay quiet to protect the brand. You stay quiet to deny the audience a story. You stay quiet because a camera needs content, and your silence starves it. That's why so many later appearances by suspected bosses became performances of non-performance. Blank faces, short answers, legal shields. Not because they didn't understand the questions, but because they understood the medium. Television created a new kind of battlefield where winning didn't require proving innocence. It required refusing to feed the narrative. And yet even that had a cost. Because silence on camera doesn't look like strength to everyone. To many viewers, it looked like arrogance. It looked like a man hiding behind technicalities. It looked like power refusing accountability. And once the public starts reading arrogance into silence, the old protective cloak of Omertà becomes a spotlight of its own. So in a strange way, the Mafia was trapped. Talk, and you create evidence. Stay silent, and you create suspicion. The bosses could still win in court. They could still outlast individual investigations. But now they had to fight a second war at the same time, the war of perception. That is the true turning point of 1951. Not that the Mafia was exposed, because it had been exposed in pieces for years, but that exposure became a mass experience. It became something that happened at the same hour in millions of rooms, while people ate dinner, while fathers smoked by the radio, while children stared at the screen and learned what power looked like when it was forced to answer questions. And the bosses, for the first time, had to accept that their world was no longer sealed off from the public by fear alone. A camera could cross borders that gunmen couldn't. A broadcast could reach places where intimidation didn't work. And a single insider, speaking calmly, could do what dozens of raids never accomplished: make the public believe the system was real. That's why every boss in America learned the new rule in 1951. The code of silence wasn't dead, but it was no longer enough to be silent in a back room. Now you had to be silent under lights, silent under microphones, silent while the whole country watched you breathe. And once that became the rule, organized crime didn't just change its tactics. It changed its identity, becoming more corporate, more insulated, more focused on controlling information than controlling corners. Because in the era of television, the most dangerous leak isn't blood. It's a story told clearly, live to an audience that finally understands what it's hearing. So here's the question to sit with. If you were a boss watching that broadcast in 1951, do you go harder on fear, or do you go harder on invisibility?